Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we have a very special guest. He's author Geoff Shepard, who had worked on the defense of Richard Nixon during the impeachment trial and has subsequently written 3 books on Richard Nixon. And he has striven to challenge the orthodoxy on Richard Nixon. So even those who acknowledge Nixon's accomplishments as president still say, well, you know, Watergate, that was terrible. You know, and they caught Nixon, they got Nixon, they had him red-handed, they had him dead to rights, and all the people who were against Nixon were vindicated, whether it was Judge John Sirica, Peter Rodino in the House Judiciary Committee, Sam Ervin in the Watergate Committee, the Archibald Cox, Dion Jaworski, all of those, they've all vindicated, including the whistleblower John Dean. Now, you have challenged all of that. You said, you know, that isn't true. Just about every ingredient of that story is not true. So, you know, perhaps you could start off saying a little bit about yourself and then tell us in what way is the officially accepted version of Watergate not true?
Sure, George. Thank you and Peter for having me on. I grew up in Southern California and went to Whittier College, which is where Richard Nixon went 30 years before. And from there, I went to Harvard Law School. And right out of Harvard, I was chosen to be a White House fellow. So I came to Washington at the ripe age of 24. My first job was a member of the White House staff. And I stayed for 5 years. And I worked on the domestic council doing policy planning work on behalf of the president. And then Watergate came, and I was the youngest lawyer on his Watergate defense team. I transcribed the tapes. I ran the document rooms that held the seized files. I staffed the counselors on the Watergate issue. And as you mentioned, it ended rather badly. The president resigned in disgrace. 24 members of his administration were convicted and imprisoned. And there things sat for the next 40 years. And what happened after that is what we're going to talk about. Some caches of documents surfaced that kind of undercut the whole narrative. But for your viewers who may not have lived through those halcyon days, let me just summarize what happened in Watergate so we know who we're dealing with here. There are 3 facts, absolute immutable facts in Watergate. There really was a break-in. There was a break-in by the Nixon campaign people into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. We know this because they were caught red-handed. There really was a cover-up. John Dean, the president's lawyer, told the White House, honestly, that nobody on the White House staff knew of the planned break-in. You couldn't say that about the campaign people, but nobody employed in the White House knew about the break-in. And the White House built its whole defense around that assertion. The difficulty was that John's task of protecting White House interests, he interpreted as protecting the people at the campaign also. So he was orchestrating a cover-up, and his cover-up infected people on the White House staff who weren't involved in the first place, but certainly were tainted by what John was doing, particularly when the cover-up failed, and it should have failed. Because John Dean ran to the prosecutors and offered up his former colleagues in an attempt to get immunity. Now, the career prosecutors, the one who's prosecuted the burglars and broke the cover-up, they wouldn't give John Dean immunity because they concluded he was too intimately involved in the cover-up. So what he did was he ran to Congress. And Congress had established a select Senate committee to investigate the 72 campaign known as the Irvin Committee, and they gave John immunity. Now, they were looking for dramatic witnesses, not unlike today, and John was perfect. But having given him immunity, they needed to cast him as a hero. So John, in the narrative, is a hero, but John did it. That's the difficulty, and that's what the battle is over. I was there, I saw it, I lived through it. I know it better than anyone because I relive it almost every day.
Could I just ask a question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
You said there was no White House involvement, but as far as I recall, people like Howard Hunt, who was involved in the break-in, he had worked at the White House. I mean, wasn't he part of the plumbers unit, and wasn't the plumbers unit at the heart of?
Yeah. Let me go through it just a little bit more slowly, Peter, but George, but you get stuck in the weeds really early on. So John Dean was...
maybe a better way to do this. I apologize, George. What is the biggest misconception about Watergate? Because I think that when you hear it in the mainstream media, it's bigger than Watergate. It's just a term, and I think it displaces it from facts. Okay, because that's one of the things that bothers me when it's dealt with Trump. Again, I apologize to you, George, but what is the biggest misconception about Watergate?
Well, the narrative is totally upside down, but people believe the narrative because they saw much of it on the Irvin Committee, and the Irvin Committee had no Nixon defenders, so it was one point of view presented on nationwide TV, and that survived. And what I've uncovered, which we'll get to, we don't want to jump to the conclusion too soon. The prosecutors wanted to nail Nixon and his people so badly that they cheated. They misrepresented to the public, they misrepresented to the Congress, and they denied the defendants their Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment rights to due process. But nobody knew that. That was all done in secret. So let me go back to the very start. John Dean is tasked in 1972, going into Nixon's reelection. That's going to be in November of 72. John is tasked with developing a campaign intelligence plan. Everybody has one. It's called today opposition research. You want to know all about your opponent, their weaknesses, their money support, where they're going to be, what they're going to say. And to John Dean's everlasting regret and the nation's, he picked Gordon Liddy to do this. And Gordon Liddy turned out to be a criminal mind. He got carried away. He developed a plan that included proposals for mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. Just incredible stuff. And Dean's problem was he was at two meetings in January and February of 1972, where this plan was discussed in front of John Mitchell, while John Mitchell was still Attorney General of the United States. So months later, when the burglars get arrested, Dean realizes he's at risk of prosecution because of that meeting. So he interprets his task of protecting the White House to include protecting the reelection committee. You can appreciate John Dean's role better if you think he was working for the reelection committee and not the Nixon White House. He proceeds to go with his cover-up. The burglars are indicted and convicted.
Why did John Dean get involved in this? I mean, he's the White House counsel. Why is he involved with the committee to re-elect the president? How did that come about?
Well, because he was asked to create this campaign intelligence plan.
Who asked him to do it? Who asked him to create this?
Bob Haldeman. Now, it's not clear whether John Dean sought the responsibility. But what had happened at the time, and again, you get wonderfully off into the weeds. Remember, there were all the upsets about the Vietnam War. There were riots, there were protests, there were campuses being shut down. And the Department of Justice was trying to gather intelligence on what was going to happen next. And John Dean was the liaison as the president's lawyer with the Department of Justice. So it wasn't totally irrational for him to move from that into campaign intelligence. The difficulty was this guy, Gordon Liddy. Now, I worked with Gordon at the Treasury Department as a White House fellow, and he was on the domestic counsel staff on the White House with me before he went to the re-election committee. And I thought he was dangerous at the time, and I said so. But no one listened. I was only a kid. And one of those great regrets of the world. If Liddy hadn't been there, Nixon would have finished out his term. But Liddy created this terrible plan, and they got caught. Then it turned out, just what George said, there had been earlier involvement of Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt on behalf of the special unit created at the White House to stop leaks after the Pentagon Papers leaked. And that was the challenging the legitimacy of our involvement in the Vietnam War. And they decided that they didn't, Daniel Ellsberg, who had done the leak, was a consultant to the Rand Corporation, a very, very substantial think tank, defense think tank. And Ellsberg had access to 54,000 other documents. And they didn't know what else he was going to leak. So they got the idea, well, maybe he told his psychiatrist what his intent is. And they interviewed the shrink, and the shrink didn't want to cooperate. So they came up with this idea of, well, let's go have a look. Let's do a black bag job and examine his files. You know, go in at night, nobody will know, everything will be great. And the two people tasked to do that by the guys running the plumbers unit were Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. Now, the break-in didn't find anything, but it was hardly a silent break-in. They couldn't pick the lock, so they broke in, made it look like a drug bust, somebody after narcotics. And the natural result of that was there was a police report. They didn't know the White House had done it, but they sure knew he was broken into. So the reason John Dean used to run the cover-up was the possible connection of Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, who clearly had masterminded the Democratic National Committee break-in, the Watergate break-in, which the White House wasn't involved in. So they didn't know. But they sure as hell knew about the plumbers break-in. They'd authorized it. So Dean is saying, we can't let this get out. We can't let this get out. We've got to run the cover-up. But he wasn't telling them, my view, he wasn't telling them of the criminal acts he was committing in the name of the cover-up. When it failed and he was facing prosecution, serious prosecution, he gave up, volunteered the information about the plumbers break-in, and sold out his former colleagues. So
well, you know, one of the things I find very, I just only saw it a few months ago. It's something that YouTube just suggested to me because I watch a lot of political things, and it was
Sure.
John Ehrlichman, and he was hawking his book after he came out of Lompoc.
Yeah.
And I was surprised. He said when there was a discussion of the cover-up and the hush money and all that, he said, this is years later, and it's his interpretation, that Nixon didn't need to get involved in these conversations. But Nixon was, he said, quote unquote, bored. Okay. And he kind of pushed himself into it. And Ehrlichman said he didn't really need to be involved, that he should have never known anything about it at all. It was such a low-level minor thing. But Nixon took an interest in it because, quote unquote, he was bored. I found that to be, I mean, having lived through it, I was a very small boy.
Yeah.
I played hooky from school to watch the hearings.
To watch the hearings, yeah.
Yes.
Well, let me assure you, everybody in the White House was watching the hearings too. 3 quick points, Peter. One, John Ehrlichman hired me. I was on his staff. I think the absolute world of him. I think he really got shafted. He wasn't involved, and yet he was sent to the gallows. And you know, it cost him everything. Secondly,
it's very interesting watching those interviews with him. This is just a really odd aside. He sounds exactly like Richard Nixon when he's speaking. I was astounded by that.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
He was prosecuted in the plumber's case first. And since I had run the document rooms where the seized files were, I was asked to give some documents to the prosecution. And in American law, we have something called chain of custody. You have to tell how this memo got to court. So I was a chain of custody witness for the government against my mentor and best friend, John Ehrlichman, in the prosecution of the plumber's trial. You talk about stress and feeling guilty and all that sort of thing. Well, John's point is there was a concept back in that era, maybe today, called plausible deniability. We don't tell the president 3/4 of what's going on, so he doesn't have to get questioned about it. He can say, I don't know anything about it. Happens 100 times a day today. I don't know. I wasn't involved. I don't go to the border.
Ronald Reagan in Iran-Contra. They kept everything away from him. Yeah.
And I think that's very fair. Plausible deniability is a excellent preventive device. The difficulty the White House had was these yahoos had gone over to John Mitchell's office to discuss the plan. And it's not to digress. Liddy shows up at the campaign, comes over from the White House, says, I've been promised $1 million for my campaign intelligence plan. Boy, are we going to have fun. And Jeb Magruder, who's acting head of CREEP before the Attorney General comes over, says, well, that may be, but the only person with the ability, with the authority to commit $1 million is John Mitchell, and he's not here. So we have to go see him. So they went and called on John Mitchell and told him about this plan for a budgetary reason. I mean, you talk about a violation of plausible deniability. And John Dean says in the second meeting, there were 2 meetings, that he shows up and he says, we shouldn't even be talking about this in front of the Attorney General. And he creates the impression that it was a bad idea, but what he meant was, you run this thing through me. I'm responsible for campaign intelligence. Keep it away from Mitchell. But when the whole thing came down, Dean says, I'm just an innocent kid. I was doing what I was told. Now, we got all the tapes of the meetings with President Nixon. We don't have any tapes of Dean's meetings with anybody else on the White House staff. So it comes down to Dean's word, they knew what I was doing, against their word, that they had no idea he was committing criminal acts in his defense of the committee, the re-election committee.
Well, in a strange way, Dean is one of the major culprits here, and he's the one that comes out as the darling out of Watergate. It's really interesting how it's inverted.
No, that's absolutely correct. That's you asked what is wrong with the narrative. The narrative that John Dean is some kind of Watergate hero. It's one of the great frauds of all time. I mean, he appears all the time on TV today, and they always say, well, he's the president's lawyer. But they don't say he was disbarred. He pled guilty to a felony. He was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison for his role in Watergate. He was disbarred from the practice of law. He hasn't been able to legally represent anybody in court or give legal advice for 45 years. Mm-hmm. And when the Virginia Bar Association sought to disbar him, John was being treated by a hero by everybody else, but somehow the Bar Association didn't get the word, and they accused him of suborning perjury. That's a legal term where you are encouraging other people to lie.
So I was just wondering that. So when we get to the famous cancer on the presidency conversation, which was
Let me come back to that.
okay, right.
4 accusations of John Dean.
Mhm.
He suborned perjury. He embezzled money from the campaign. No money changes hands in Watergate, except Dean took $4,000 of campaign funds to pay for his honeymoon. He destroyed evidence that Howard Hunt left in his safe that he said would show everything he was doing under the direction and control of the White House, which included John Dean. And John Dean conveniently destroyed that evidence of Hunt's notebooks and Hunt's address books. And finally, Dean was authorizing the payment of money to the Watergate defendants. He was the guy who said, okay, $350,000 was paid under Dean's authority. So he's heavily involved in the cover-up, knew in advance of the plan. So he's running the plan, okay? And the Watergate burglars, 7 of them are convicted of the burglary, and sentencing is postponed for 2 months. That's perfectly normal under American law. We do an investigation of the convicts to enable the judge to decide what a fair sentence is. Sentencing is due March 23rd, 1973. Dean goes in to see the president 2 days before that because he's just learned that Howard Hunt is threatening to reveal the plumber's break-in if the campaign committee doesn't hurry up and pay some legal bills. And by the way, I'm going to be sent off to prison on Friday, 2 days from now, and you guys are slow pay on my expenses, and somebody's got to take care of my family. So I want 50,000. I owe 70 in legal fees. I want 50,000 of walking around money to protect my family. Dean goes and tells Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman says, sounds like blackmail to me. I mean, legal fees is one thing. We've been paying those, not this other thing. Dean says, well, what should I do? And Ehrlichman says, go talk to Mitchell. This isn't a White House problem. This is a campaign problem. And the White House had always taken that position. Haldeman and Ehrlichman said, look, it's not here. Your job is to keep it over there. So Dean comes in to see Nixon and says, you don't know what's been going on. This is all on tape. This is March 21st. There's a cancer near the presidency. It's growing, it's mutating. You don't know what's been going on, but people have committed perjury. They're going to have to do more. And you're going to have to make some decisions that are pretty serious. Let me tell you about it. So for the first time, 9 months after the break-in, the president's lawyer decides to tell the president what's been going on. And this comes back to Ehrlichman's comment and to plausible deniability. Why Dean chose to do that is beyond me, but he did. And so Nixon, it's an hour-and-a-half meeting, 10:30 to noon. And they toy with all kinds of possibilities. But we got the tape. There is no decision to pay the money. But the prosecutors learned, this is the special prosecutors, not the career guys. They were kicked off the case. Prosecution became politicized. They learned, to their absolute delight, that Nixon learns of the blackmail demand Wednesday morning, the meeting ending at noon, and at 10 o'clock that very night, a payment was made to Howard Hunt. So what they surmise, they have no witness, not then, not now, not ever. What must have happened? Hold up your hand, get in front of the screen. 5 things had to happen. Nixon learns of the blackmail demand from John Dean. He tells Haldeman, his chief of staff, who is in the meeting too, to call Mitchell, who's head of the campaign. And he's resigned, but he's still cleaning up from the campaign. To tell Mitchell to come down to discuss what on earth to do in light of this blackmail demand. But the prosecutors say, well, there was more than that. Nixon must have told Haldeman to tell Mitchell to pay him off. Mitchell talks to his campaign aide, a man named Fred LaRue, nobody's heard about.
I remember. I remember.
Fred was the paymaster. Fred had the cash.
I remember.
Mitchell talks to LaRue, and the payment is made by LaRue 10 o'clock that very night. Now, it's a circumstantial case, but it's a very strong circumstantial case. President learns payment is made. What's the next issue? They spent, and they've written books about it in the documents, and I've got the documents. They spent a tremendous amount of time proving this. We thought that LaRue had learned of the blackmail demand much earlier, so Nixon wasn't involved. But they learned the payoff occurred at 10 o'clock that night. So they got this all tidied up, except for one fact in the chain of events that, if true, undermined their entire case. And that is they could not lock in the timing of the Mitchell call with LaRue. Okay. It had to occur to make the case against Nixon. It had to have occurred after Nixon learned of the demand. But Dean told LaRue of the demand before he went off to meet with Nixon. And LaRue's memory was he called Mitchell then in the morning of the 21st. Mitchell authorized just the payment of legal bills, not the blackmail. LaRue never brought that up. So here's the prosecutors dripping with eagerness to nail Richard Nixon with personally having approved the payment of blackmail, missing this one absolutely necessary fact. So they just lied about it. They just finessed it. They skipped it. Now, those of us on Nixon's defense team never knew they were accusing President Nixon of personally having paid the blackmail, because everybody we talked to, Nixon, Haldeman, Mitchell, and LaRue, said never in a million years. That isn't what happened. And I remember paying him in the morning, so we weren't the least bit worried about it. But we didn't know in secret the prosecutors had told the grand jurors and the prosecutors had told the House Judiciary Committee that Nixon must have personally approved. It's no wonder they named him a co-conspirator. It's no wonder they want to move the evidence to the Hill.
But you're building a very interesting, and I think George would agree with me, familiar case here, because you're a facts person. I mean, in a forensic study of what happened. But the more you explain what happened then, the more it sounds like it was political. Okay, I mean,
well, of course it was.
Okay, so I mean, can you kind of set it up that way? Because
sure.
I mean, sure. George, I don't want to bore our guest here with a lot of the conversations you and I have, but John Dean sounds like Vindman to me. Okay,
he's a little Vindman, yeah. But just before you get on, talk about the political aspect, there's one very interesting thing, which was the so-called smoking gun tape, because as things developed through 1974. Nixon knew that he would be impeached. Nixon knew that therefore that he'd be tried in the Senate, but he always thought that he would probably get the 34 votes that he needed to survive until the smoking gun tape. And then that smoking gun tape, which was a conversation he had with Haldeman way back in 1972, June the 23rd, 1972. And you say that has been completely misinterpreted.
Yeah, hold that thought. Hold that thought, because the smoking gun tape didn't surface, was not publicly known until August 5th, 74, and Nixon resigns 3 days later. So it doesn't figure in the naming him a co-conspirator or in him being impeached. I mean, recommended impeachment by the House. They didn't know about that tape. So let's go through their accusations against Nixon, which were done in secret, which is what I've uncovered. Now, we got to go back. We always go back. We're so far into the weeds that it's actually fun. The smoking gun tape comes out. Nixon resigns. Everybody splits. His top three aides, John Mitchell, John Ehrlichman, and Bob Haldeman, are convicted in the cover-up trial, and the case is over. Nixon is the gold standard for political corruption. It's all done for 40 years. And then certain caches of documents start to surface that were improperly taken by the special prosecutors when they left office. These are their secret, confidential Watergate files. And they took them with them. Now, you take files with you, you get in trouble. The National
Apparently
have those files. And I was instrumental in uncovering all 4 of these caches of documents. And the first one is Leon Jaworski's confidential file. He was the second special prosecutor. He was there for the most important stuff. He doesn't stick around for the cover-up prosecutions. He goes home to Texas. He takes this file with him. He dies. He gives his papers to his alma mater, Baylor Law School in Waco, Texas. They play with them, and then they make them available to researchers. The archives is alerted that there's grand jury stuff in those files. They go down and they look at them. They seize them, bring them back up to Washington. They go through them to redact names and all this kind of stuff. And they produce them in 2013 for public consumption in response to my Freedom of Information Act request. And what those files show, this is just Jaworski's files, at least a dozen secret meetings between those prosecutors and Judge Sirica. The suppression of exculpatory evidence that shows the prosecutors knew that John Dean's story changed while he was in the hands of the prosecution. You come in, you're seeking immunity, you try to polish your story to make it more valuable. Well, if that happens, they have to disclose that to the other side. It's called the Brady rule. If the prosecution runs across exculpatory evidence, they have to share it. This game has to be played fairly. They didn't do that. Most importantly, what I learned was that Archibald Cox, the first special prosecutor, became so worried about Judge Sirica and his pro-prosecution rulings. I mean, he may as well have sat at the prosecution table, that Archie Cox went to see his good friend, the chief judge of the appellate court, the DC Circuit, and urged him to stack the deck on appeals so that Sirica wouldn't be reversed. Because Cox was worried they'd win at trial because Sirica would hand it to him. But because of the violations of due process, they'd lose on appeal. So he backstopped it to get Judge Bazelon to stack the decks, which Bazelon then did. Okay, all of that came to light. That's my second book. If you go on my website, www.shepardonwatergate.com.
We'll post it.
Absolutely. That's where the links are to all these documents. You see, what distinguishes me from everybody else is I got the documents. You can't deny. These are publicly available documents prepared by the prosecution. Then after that led to my 2015 book. But after the book was published, the secret files of James Vorenberg surfaced at Harvard Law School. He was Cox's first hire, and he's really the Svengali behind the throne, making it political. He hired everybody in the special prosecutor's staff. He announced at the first press conference they wouldn't just investigate Watergate, they'd investigate every act the Nixon administration took since taking office. Yeah. And he turned it into a hugely political investigation of everything Nixon, not just Watergate. And then there was a third guy who was the counsel to the special prosecutor, a gentleman named Phil Lacavara. And he took his files with him. And he didn't give them to the archives till 2020. And again, I'm the first person to go through these. And then finally, because we're taking up time here, when the Judge Sirica secretly met with Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, and they agreed the law was too unclear on whether you could indict a sitting president. So what they should do is leave his impeachment to the House Judiciary Committee. Well, the prosecutors had gathered all this evidence. I mean, that in U.S. law, nothing gets in the way of the grand jury. I mean, you've got to show up, you've got to turn the stuff over. You can take the fifth, but that's about it. So they had spent a year gathering evidence for criminal prosecution. That's the right of the grand jury. But before you can use that evidence in court, our Bill of Rights provides the defendant with all kinds of protections. No protection in front of the grand jury. It's a nice scheme, but lots of protections in front of the court. But if you take the grand jury evidence and you send it up to the Hill, up to the House Judiciary Committee, where it can be used for political purposes, the object of your investigation and the people you're trying to damage have no rights, no due process, because there's no court. So you say Peter's accused of my murder. The government has to put on the case through sworn testimony of witnesses that Peter can cross-examine and Peter can put on his own thing. And if we indict Peter, he gets a speedy trial. It's a public trial. Everything's got to be laid out on the table. Nothing like that in front of a congressional hearing. No public trial. You're the only person under oath. Nobody else is under oath. They can say anything they want. They can leak anything they want. And this idea of a speedy trial, it only comes into effect when you've been indicted. So what happened in Watergate was the new politicized special prosecution. You talk to people on both sides of the aisle today, and they will tell you special prosecutors are dangerous as they can be because they've only got one goal. Let's go get them.
That's right.
It's the equivalent. We have something called a bill of attainder. You can't pass a law that says we want to go get this guy for something he did before. Well, that's what happens with these congressional hearings. They conduct a legislative trial, and they get the cooperation of the Department of Justice to hold off real prosecution where all the rights would apply. Now, let me walk you through that. It gets in advance, but let me get to it right now. The career prosecutors who prosecuted the burglars broke the cover-up as it was becoming politicized. They put out a press release that promised a comprehensive Watergate indictment within 2 months. Except when a special prosecution was formed, those indictments, the career guys were relieved of any responsibility, and the indictments didn't show up for 10 months, which enabled the Irvin Committee to conduct its own legislative trial, put people on the air, fasten down the narrative. There were no defenders of Dick Nixon on that hearing. Well, right. Today, you got the January 6th committee. It's in the House. Let me tell you, the Department of Justice has put off prosecutions of the January 6th riot to enable the January 6th committee to interview 1,200 witnesses, to put on selected videotapes, to make all kinds of claims. No Trump defender on that committee. You know, it's not really a legitimate committee, but they've had a field day. And compare that, if I may, just for a moment, with the cryptocurrency collapse. They're all geared up. Maxine Waters is all geared up to have a hearing, so we can talk to Sam about what he did and all that. And the department out of nowhere suddenly indicts him. Ends any idea of hearings. Now, people who don't like Democrats say that was because 95% of his money went to Democrats, and that was going to become explored under oath in front of the Congress and be disclosed. Well, we don't want that to come out, so the Department of Justice just indicts
Well,
him.
it's a perversion of the system. I mean, you have the prosecution suddenly indicts him, so he can't talk. I mean, doesn't the prosecution want him to talk?
Well,
But, I mean,
well,
it's
you know,
completely inverted.
but you see, that's what's so peculiar about our system of three co-equal branches of government. There are lots of books about the Irvin Committee, and one of them quotes the staff being very discouraged when the special prosecutor is named. And Sam Dash says, yeah, but nobody's been indicted. They're not going to interfere with what we're doing. Well, the first thing Archie Cox did when he came to town in May was go into court to try to prevent Judge Sirica from giving immunity to John Dean as recommended by the Irvin Committee. And Archie said, you know, if these witnesses start testifying in public, it will so poison the jury pool, we can't prosecute them. And Sirica, who had called for the creation of the Senate committee in the first place, said, nah, we want the committee to go forward. We'll deal with poisoning the jury pool in the future if it turns out that way. And then, of course, since he appointed himself to preside over the trial, he found there was no juror bias. The jury pool was just fine. 52,000 column inches of news over 2.5 years on Watergate. And Judge Sirica, in his judicial wisdom, said, nah, that didn't adversely affect the jury pool. Don't worry about it. We can give him
and there was also, of course, the issue that Sirica announced that he was convinced of the guilt of these Watergate burglars, and that obviously they were covering up for senior officials, and he slapped these ridiculous prison terms in order to get them to talk. So that was a complete clear violation of the Constitution, like cruel and unusual.
I mean, it was James McCord that had written to the judge and said that the trial itself. I mean, right. I don't want to go totally in the weeds here.
Right. But even so, you can't sort of sentence people to 25, 30 years in prison for a burglary.
Maximum John Sirica, the single most reverse judge in the DC circuit, known to be incredibly biased. They all held the press and everybody else held their nose. He was named Man of the Year by Time magazine. And it's all part of the fraud, all part of this fraud. John Dean is made into
we're rapidly running out of time here. Yeah. Let's look at August of 1974. I mean, again, you've forensically presented in a very short amount of time, I would say, your case. But I mean, Republican senators, I mean, they weren't in the dark about all of this, okay? I mean, when, Nixon resigned because, I mean, what was it? Barry Goldwater famously walked from Congress to the White House.
Well,
I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up the issue.
Let's go back over three things. We got 15 minutes. Let's go back.
Okay, but then we're just mention about the smoking gun tape, because everybody's
I want to do the smoking gun.
Yeah.
And then I want to compare and contrast yesterday to today, okay? I'm somewhat familiar with the smoking gun. I'm the third person who heard it. I'm the one who prepared the first transcript. I'm the one who called it the smoking gun. So what happens is the Supreme Court rules on the morning of July 24th, 1974, these 65 tapes have to be turned over to the prosecutor. Nixon is talking to Fred Bizarre, my boss, who was his lead Watergate defense lawyer. And Nixon says, there's this tape you ought to go listen to. Now, Nixon wouldn't let the lawyers hear the tapes because he said they'd never be turned over. So the lawyers hadn't heard many of the tapes. They'd heard some, but not all. Fred goes and hears the tape. Fred is appalled. It is a tape of June 23rd, 1972, 6 days after the Watergate break-in arrest. And Haldeman comes in, says, the investigation is going in a direction we don't want it to go. They're tracing the money. And Nixon says, well, can't Pat Gray stop it? And Haldeman says, well, he'd like to, but he doesn't have a reason. But John Dean has forwarded this idea that the way to turn it off is to get the CIA to tell the FBI, don't interview these guys because they're part of our operation. And we're perfectly set up to do this because the FBI already believes they've stumbled into an international incident. It's foreign money, foreign banks. It's very strange, all going out of Miami. President concurs. That's the end of the tape. Haldeman and Ehrlichman meet with Richard Helms and Vern Walters, the deputy, and say, look, tell Pat Gray not to interview these two guys because all this stuff is going to come out about Hunt. Now, we talked about Howard Hunt and him being involved in the plumbers break-in, but he was a career CIA agent, and he was running the training of the private army that was going to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. He was the mysterious Eduardo. So when the White House told Hunt, you can't personally be involved in the plumbers break-in in this entry into Fielding's office, he said, well, I have some friends down in Cuba who would do it. And he convinced them to do it. Well, the CIA agrees because they don't want news to come out about Howard Hunt. So they tell Pat Gray, don't do this. Dean calls to Pat Gray the next day and says, you got the word, don't interview these two guys. Now, and nobody knew they discussed this with Nixon. Everybody knew Ehrlichman and Haldeman met with him. They'd met with Hunt and Walters. They put a hold on the interviews, and 10 days later they removed it. And those two interviews of those two witnesses amounted to nothing. Okay? But what happened when Bizard heard the tape is not clear that it was only those two witnesses. It's there if you look for it. But it also is available to the interpretation that Nixon was trying to shut down the entire investigation.
So could I just butt in? Wasn't there also an issue about this money? The money that was found in one of the burglars' wallet, it could be traced to Dwayne Andreas, who was a Democrat, anonymous Democrat who had contributed to the Nixon committee, and Nixon wanted to maintain the anonymity of these people.
Let's go up that street just for a second. There's another rabbit hole.
Yeah.
A new campaign law was coming into effect on April 7th, 1972. If you gave money after that, it had to be disclosed. If you gave money before that, it wouldn't be disclosed. There were two major contributions from prominent Democrats who wanted to support Nixon, to hedge their bets, but under promise it would never be disclosed. One of those was Dwayne Andreas, CEO of Archer Daniel Midland's, a giant agribusiness. Another was a Texas oil man named Robert Allen. What Andreas did was give $25,000 in cash. What Robert Allen did was get a Mexican lawyer, very prominent Mexican lawyer for his Mexican subsidiary, to write traveler's checks and forward them to the campaign because they couldn't be traced. When the campaign official picked up the Dwayne Andreas money, he didn't want to carry around $25,000, so he bought a traveler's check made out to himself. He gave that to the committee. The committee became worried about this April 7th deadline, brings it up with Gordon Liddy, our friend Gordon Liddy, who messed up the plumbers break-in and the Watergate break-in. He says, well, I think it's legal contributions. But just to be sure, I'm going to go launder that money through my friend in Miami, my newfound best friend, this Cuban that I did the break-in with. Okay, down in the Fielding break-in out in LA. So he takes the checks down there, gives them to Bernard Barker, says, I need cash. Barker goes to his bank, happens to be the International Bank of Miami, and says, I need $81,000 in cash. Not surprisingly, the bank doesn't have that kind of cash lying around. So they ask the Federal Reserve Bank of Miami, and they send over $50,000 of $100 bills, uncirculated, sequentially numbered. Liddy gives that to the campaign committee. It goes in the safe. People deal with cash all the time. 6 weeks later, he withdraws money from the treasurer to give to his Cubans that are going to break into the DNC. Some of those same uncirculated $100 bills end up in the Cubans' pockets and in their hotel room. They get caught red-handed. The FBI has this money. They know the numbers. It's easily traced through the Fed to Miami. The Miami Fed says, shit, we gave it to International Bank. That's Bernard Barker's. They produce the traveler's checks. At this point, they want to talk to the campaign official who bought that $25,000 check in his own name. He calls up the committee, Maurice Stans, who's head of finance. He says they're going to learn about Dwayne Andrea's name, and we promised him he would never. So Maurice Stans calls up John Dean and says, my God, the FBI is looking in the wrong direction. This has nothing to do with Watergate. John Dean has just come from his meeting with Pat Gray. Pat Gray says, I think we stumbled into a CIA operation. So John Dean tells Haldeman, get the CIA to tell him, don't interview these two guys, Dwayne Andreas and the Mexican attorney. They tell the CIA that.
Can you, you've promised that already twice making a comparison to Watergate and obviously the saga surrounding the 45th president of the United States.
Okay, let me just stop. So the smoking gun is misinterpreted from the get-go. They weren't trying to stop the investigation. They're trying to protect two Democrats. John Dean knew this all along. But he finally put it in writing in a book that was published in 2014. So nobody knows this, but the reason Nixon's defense collapsed completely was a mistake, out and out mistake. Okay.
Well, you know, it's interesting that there was, I remember the commentary that the committee to re-elect the president creep, and a lot of the left made fun of that, but there's really one creep in all of this, and it's John Dean.
Well, he's known all along it was misunderstood and just kept quiet. When he testified in court on behalf of the government, Haldeman's lawyers trying to say, but that was just a political decision. And Dean doesn't agree. He says, well, they were worried about Liddy. So you swear when you're on the stand, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But John Dean didn't do that. We didn't have to wait 50 years to learn this. Okay, yesterday and today. The Irvin Committee is a Senate Select Committee, but it's just as loaded as the January 6th, the House Select Committee. There are no Nixon defenders. It was created by vote of 77-0. That's an odd number for a 100-man Senate, because half the Republicans boycotted the vote because the vote was to look into only the 72 presidential campaign and to give Democrats a one-vote majority. Normally, when it's an ethical investigation, it's tied. But this wasn't tied. This was a Democrat wish hunt focused only on Nixon. The Republicans didn't want to play. The committee was able to operate for 10 without indictment. So they conducted a legislative trial. So did the J6 committee. But here's the differences. One, Nixon was already a lame duck. They were trying to void his landslide reelection.
Exactly.
Okay? Yep. Now, as a lame duck, power is slipping away from him throughout Watergate's unfolding. At the end, he's got nothing at all. With the J6, they're trying to prevent Trump's election. So it's a different kind of attitude. to them, this dramatic, we're going to recommend his prosecution. Well, they would have done that on the first day. This whole thing is political theater. What's different back then is there was only one side in the press. There was no Fox News, no talk radio, no podcasts like this. Today, there's another side. Now, there's a big conflict and you fight over it like mad, but at least there's some people coming out saying, this isn't a legitimate committee. And remember, Nixon was president, so the attackers didn't control the Department of Justice. They did control the special prosecutor. Biden is president, so the Department of Justice is under Democrat control. So when what I think is an illegitimate committee finds somebody in contempt and recommends his prosecution, if it were a Republican Department of Justice, they wouldn't prosecute. They didn't prosecute the former Attorney General when he wouldn't supply information on Fast and Furious, Eric Holder. But today, I mean, this is just incredible. We'll end with this.
Well, one thing.
Go
ahead, real quick.
I have the most important point to make.
Of course.
Nancy Pelosi has had a 3-vote majority in the House, and she has rammed through incredible stuff. Okay. They did away a little bit before with the filibuster on federal judges, so they could confirm a couple judges on the DC circuit. Well, the reaction is the Republicans confirmed a whole bunch of justices on the Supreme Court. Nancy Pelosi did away with in-person voting. You could vote by proxy, so nobody even bothers to come to work. They have a setup where the committees don't even have to function. She just works it out and rams it through. These naming these guys for prosecution and referring them to the Department of Justice, stripping Republicans of their campaign assignments, riding roughshod over the minority because of a 3-vote margin. This is called the tyranny of the majority. Well, wait till next month.
Right, but could I just Geoff? Could I just ask? I mean, what ties the two together? The destruction of Trump, the destruction of Nixon, is a kind of visceral hatred on the part of the Democrats, a visceral hatred on the part of the all-powerful liberal media. What do you think ties that together? Why this common hatred for both Nixon and Trump?
And let me add on to that. Let me add on to George's question, because I think it's important here. I was a very young person when this was all going on. My father was a dyed-in-wool Republican. I mean, real Republican.
Okay.
And I lived in an entirely Republican community in a little town outside of Denver, Colorado.
Good for you.
When this was going on, I could remember my parents and the neighbors and everyone talking, they're taking our president from us. They're taking him away. The media, the liberal media, the coastal elites, they're taking our president away. And my father's generation never forgot that. It was always a real sore point.
Yes, there are lots of people who would tell you the Clinton impeachment was really payback for what they did to Nixon. But the precedent it's set, today impeachment's nothing. Why don't we come to work and impeach him this week? The bitterness within the House is not going to heal. For decades, nobody wants to get along. Nobody wants to work something out because of Nancy Pelosi presided over this stuff, and she drifts off, as this famous heroine. And the bitterness of the Republicans who have just been reamed. The vote on releasing Trump's tax returns was 24-16. Well, with a 3-vote majority, how do you get a Ways and Means Committee with 8 votes ahead of the other side? I mean, everything is stacked, and the press loves it, and they laud it. And you're sitting there saying, you know, the piper's going to have to be paid, and that's yet to come. And you lose a faith in your nation. I was on a panel the other day, private, non-public panel, and I said, look what's happened. We've destroyed the family. The government largesse and everything else. You don't need to be married. You don't need to be in a family. We have undermined every institution that we have. Nobody believes in anything anymore. It's all politicized. And we've raised a full generation of our children to not believe in America, to think everything about America is wrong because that's what they're told in academia. And I don't see how we're going to recover.
But it's really interesting, particularly in the case of Nixon, because it's just not the silent majority. It was a huge silent majority. I mean, it's never been repeated. His election landslide. It's a hallmark. Okay, and
it is the modern equivalent.
The pattern is that, again, you have, I mean, George and I have talked about this at great length, and you've already given a kind of a checklist. I mean, academia, the media, entertainment, you know, it's all stacked. And still, remarkably, it's still about 50-50. I mean, one side has so few resources and actually are very poor. A lot of them are very poor people, and they still hold the line. It's really quite incredible.
Right, but I think that's true. But I think the key, and I think this goes back to Watergate, it goes back to Trump, is that the instruments of power are in the hands of the Democrats and their supporters. So Nixon was a Republican president, but the Justice Department wasn't under his control. Same with Trump, a Republican.
We thought this most recent midterm election would right the ship, and we got outsmarted. So we're waiting on 2 more years. The only thing that's going to fix it, it's going to take a long time, is a free and vibrant press. Got to have that. Got to be able to communicate. And what we'll call the silent majority, or the blue collar Americas, what we think of as the traditional America, right thinking Americans, learning the election tricks about early voting and all that, and having a chance to win these close elections. Because we didn't win big. We lost a whole bunch of really close elections. And that's not going to hold in I don't believe, in 2024. This has been great. I've got a blizzard outside.
Thank you so much, Geoff.
We both have a blizzard. I have a blizzard too.
Well, it's a very interesting discussion.
We can do this again.
Yeah,
I'd love to.
The 50th anniversary of Watergate will unfold through the end of 2024. There's lots more events to come, lots more developments,
right?
And I think the public is deserving of knowing what was done then, so they can appreciate what's going on today.
Well, I think March the 21st of next year will be the 50-year anniversary of the cancer on the presidency conversation. That might be a good time to reconvene.
You bet.
Now we know who is Mr. Smoking Gun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. On the tape. Bye-bye.